I'm going to cover for you an overview, or provide with you an overview, and I hope I don't squash this computer here, an overview of climate change policy in the states domestically, and what I see as a prevailing trend. I began tracking climate change policy in 1999 after the United States first rejected the Kyoto Protocol, and I wanted to see what kinds of legislation was being introduced at the state level. I used two key words in looking for this type of legislation: carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And the trends were very interesting. From 1999, and in particular in 2000, we saw a steady increase in the introductions of legislation until 2001. And as you can imagine, because of September 11th, there was a readjustment across the country in terms of our needs for safety, infrastructure, and other items that became a higher priority immediately. And we saw the increase of legislation actually decline. But since that time, we've gone from 60 bills being introduced across the country to over 360 bills introduced across the country. And they come in a variety of categories. The first is in stationary emissions of carbon dioxide, and that's power plants across the country. Anything that burned fossil fuel, there was an introduction of legislation to perhaps cap the carbon dioxide that was emitted by that power plant. We also saw caps being introduced for mobile emissions with vehicles. In particular, in California, we saw the low emitting vehicle bill, and that actually transferred across to several states, particularly in the New England states. We've also seen renewable portfolios introduced. We've seen carbon sequestration bills introduced. Now, what's interesting about the carbon sequestration bills is that, particularly along the coastal states, there are environmental barriers to drilling. Yet, when we're talking about carbon sequestration, you still need to drill a hole to put the carbon in and to bring something out. So we're sort of a little bit in an odd place right now, where the environmentalists don't want us to drill for natural gas or for oil, but they do want us to drill to put carbon down under the ocean floor. And as a good friend of mine who's a geologist, he said, you know, if you put a hole in down there, you got to wonder what's going to come out first, and you want to capture that and perhaps use that. So that's an interesting dynamic that's going on right now. We've also seen greenhouse gas registries multiply across the country in almost 50 states, where the companies would voluntarily report their greenhouse gas emissions. There have been studies. There have been what I would call anti-Kyoto bills, bills that say we do not want to have any kind of carbon cap and trade or a carbon tax. And lastly, the latest bills that have been coming out, we've seen some outright bans of the use of coal for energy. And we've seen that in Hawaii and a few other places. Those bills have not passed, but they're being introduced. Now, the trend is interesting. When we're talking about climate change policy, the two prevailing thoughts or solutions to global warming problems or climate change is either a carbon tax or a carbon cap and trade system. Both of these policy initiatives do one thing. They transfer money. The first either transfers money from the consumers into the hands of government, or the second, the carbon cap and trade system, transfers money from consumers into the hands of a conglomerate of carbon-fueled companies, or companies that want to trade carbon credits. And so we're having a transfer of wealth. We're proposing a transfer of wealth, and yet we're really not doing anything about carbon dioxide emissions when you look at that scientifically. And that's the interesting debate that I think that we need to have in the country. When I talk about the carbon cap and trade system, probably my greatest fear in this trend of thought, when you look at our current presidential candidates, all three of them support or have claimed support for a carbon cap and trade system. We could inadvertently put into place what I would call a carbon cartel. both nationally here in the United States as well as internationally, where we're using carbon credits as a new form for transactions and how we would have trade. That currency for carbon credits would ultimately wind up being regulated by government as it sets a carbon standard, a carbon dioxide standard, to limit, by regulation, emissions. And so what you really have here is government setting the price for energy rather than markets, rather than free markets. And so that, on either system, through a carbon tax or through a carbon cap and trade policy, winds up raising the cost of energy for consumers and ultimately the cost of energy for our economy. How does this play out? Well, a few years ago, the Chicago Climate Exchange was established, and carbon credits were placed on the exchange, and some companies began to purchase them. What was interesting is the Iowa Farm Bureau became a broker for the Chicago Climate Exchange so that it could sell credits to farmers for doing things that they already do with their land. They would receive, the Farm Bureau receives 10% of whatever they sell for credits on the value of the credit system as its value increases as we tighten the regulation. We've also seen nationally, and Myron will cover this a little bit further later, a lot of bills that would put into place a carbon cap and trade system or set a carbon dioxide emissions standard. And it's usually called the McCain-Lieberman bill. Today it's called the Warner-Lieberman bill. In 2004 and 2006, we did some cost studies of what that would be, and we found that it would, at that time, by 2010 to 2020, cost anywhere from $1,000 to $2,300 for the average household in the country. It is a regressive form of a policy. It's either a tax, both of these, and the poorest households, 20% of the poorest households would pay 64% of a larger burden of this policy than the higher income households. The other interesting thing that comes into play when you look at the states and who puts themselves in a selling position and who winds up being in a buying position. Well, it follows our energy portfolio in terms of what the states are able to provide for electricity and fuel. In the Northeast and the Northwest, the bulk of the states are supported by hydropower or nuclear power, neither of which emit carbon dioxide. In the South and in the West, the bulk of the power is provided by coal or natural gas. They would be in a position where they're buying credits from the Northeast or from the Northwest. In both corners of the country, a regional greenhouse gas initiative has been put into place where the governors went outside of their state legislatures and established an agreement with several states to trade within those states. They're now trying to get the South to become involved so that they can have the South purchase credits from the North. And you can see where this is going. When you look at electricity deregulation, the line pretty much follows the Mason-Dixon line, where the states in the Northeast have deregulated policies. They have their rates are higher. The top 10 states for electricity markets in all sectors would be New York, Vermont, Maine, California, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Hawaii and Alaska are also included in those states, but we have to consider them outliers because they're away from the 48 and they have to get their fuel sources shipped to them. The lowest states in terms of electricity are Kentucky, Idaho, West Virginia, Wyoming, Missouri, Washington, which is hydropower, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Utah. Those states are primarily coal states. And that's where we're seeing a dynamic come into play here, that these states that have the lowest rates would wind up buying credits from the states that have the highest rates, and you raise the cost of living for those in the southern states. So it's going to be we're in an interesting place now for our country, where we're talking about these two policies that we want to put into place for climate change. And yet, there is a third option. The third option would be a tax reform policy, essentially, where you would accelerate the depreciation value for capital investments. And those companies that have the old coal power plants that need to turn them over anyway because they're aged could do that at a much more cost-effective manner. And we would wind up not raising the cost of pricing for energy for consumers across the country. All we need to do is allow our free market to work. And all we need to do is roll back some of those taxing regulations that are preventing us today from putting cleaner equipment and cleaner technology in our refineries, in our power plants, in our vehicles, in our homes. That's my presentation. I'll now give it to Dan Simmons.